A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support. When my grandmother passed away, she left us with a trove of jewelry, each piece laden with memories and whispers of family history woven into their ornate designs, and it was decided at her funeral that her prized possessions would go to her favorite, my cousin Sarah, who had always been vocal about her longing for them. I was more of a quiet observer in our family dynamics, something of an underdog constantly overlooked, so when the time came to talk about the inheritance, I stood back, allowing the others to discuss Sarah's claims, her tears, as they painted a picture of the deserving child, the granddaughter her heart favored. But not long after, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister lurking beneath the surface, a gnawing sensation that my grandmother would not have wanted to make that decision so neatly or so soon without considering the rest of us. I started looking at the jewelry the night after the funeral, each one glimmering under the soft light of the lamp, but it wasn't the sparkle that drew me in, it was the way they seemed to pulse with a life of their own, almost as if revealing stories only I could hear. The emerald pendant, my grandmother always said, held the spirit of protection, the silver bracelet twinkled with memories of laughter and mourning, and the pearl earrings, her most cherished, echoed the vows she took, binding family together. As the days passed, I sneaked out with the jewelry one evening to my grandmother's house, the winds howling against the glass like voices pleading, wearing a heavy weight of unease as I unlocked the door to her empty living room, the barren space feeling far too strange without her tender presence. I laid the items out on the table, compelled to remember each story, but as I did, the air turned thick, heavy with an electrifying tension that set my skin prickling. I whispered my grandmother's name, a desperate plea for wisdom, and suddenly I felt it, an icy breath against my neck, a presence so real that I spun around expecting to find someone, but there was only the whisper of moths tapping ineffectively against the windows. That night, sleep evaded me as I wrestled with visions of Sarah, her face twisted with disappointment should I fail to return the jewelry, yet my heart shuddered with the instinct that something wasn't right. Then came the nightmares. In them, my grandmother appeared, her ethereal face hovering above me, her lips chanted a warning I couldn't decipher, yet the urgency behind her eyes pierced through the fog of sleep. Each night, those dreams grew darker. I saw Sarah in the attic, rifling through boxes, her hands clawing at the memories I wanted to preserve. I felt a rush of anger, a need to step in, despite everyone else dismissing me as jealous or bitter, yet I was only following my grandmother's wishes. Days melted into each other, and I found myself ensnared in the tension of relatives crowded in my small living room, each eager to claim their share, everyone casting furtive glances in my direction, waiting for me to hand over what my grandmother had apparently promised to Sarah. I held my ground, aware that Sarah's eyes glinted in the reminder of friendship, tangled with loss, hers for my grandmother, and mine for the identities we were expected to wield as family members. As the pressure mounted, so too did the whispers. Rumors spread through the family like wildfire, accusations of greed unfurling over dinner tables, bitterness painting a rift between us. I considered surrendering the jewelry just to appease the storm of hurt feelings, yet around the same time, the jewelry began haunting me in ways I could not explain, strange occurrences swirling within the confines of the house, the lights flickering, objects rearranging themselves in the darkness, and echoes of laughter that seemed to originate from the pieces themselves. I couldn't help but wonder, did my grandmother bestow her earthly treasures with the intention of continuing a cycle, or did she craft them with the precision to repel tormentors like Sarah? Then came the revelation one stormy night when I sat in silence, the rain beating against the windows like a relentless drum. That was when I discovered the hidden compartment in the emerald pendant, the chill of the metal pricking at my fingertips as I worked to open it, revealing an old photograph of my grandmother in a flowing dress and a note, its edges frayed, penned with her delicate script, warning to keep the jewelry close, the ones who covet them may have intentions that corrupt. The moment I clutched that slip of paper, a warmth flooded through me, threads of connection stretching back through generations. The intent warned me away from surrendering the legacy she left behind. The next day, I finally approached Sarah, the sunlight splintering through dark clouds, making the moment feel almost surreal. I placed my hands on the table, grounding myself as I looked into my cousin's eyes, shimmering with tears and expectancy, and I told her how our grandmother would never have wanted this kind of animosity and entitlement stemming from love. Those gems were mine, bound through blood and shared history. The room fell silent, the tension sharper than any blade. I could see the reflection of other relatives in Sarah's pupils flip-flopping between support and a need for dissension, but something snapped inside me, and a fierce voice broke through, claiming our shared bond that had long been overshadowed by greed. Time froze momentarily, and to my shock, Sarah's expression shifted. Betrayal twisted her features, but then I noticed the shadows behind her, creeping along the edges of the room, a darkness that felt familiar and foreboding. It dawned upon me that I was not the only one who had heard my grandmother's pleas. The air thickened with disquiet as it dawned on me. I wasn't just defending some jewels, I was shielding our bloodline. Clutching the pendant close to my heart, I vowed to keep the jewelry not as a mere possession but as a guardian of stories that could not be tainted by envy or desire. I realized now that sometimes protecting a legacy meant making hard choices, forcing your hand against those you love, becoming the villain in their eyes to uphold the dignity of those departed. As the shadows receded slowly, I felt it, a quiet resolve wrapping an iron grip around my heart, knowing I was not wrong for resisting Sarah's claim but rather, I was right to protect what was more sacred than envy, our family. In that moment, the chains of our ancestral stories tightened like a noose, both a blessing and a curse, binding me to a fate I would uphold, in memory of her, against all odds, even if it meant sealing the very fate of our family. I never thought I'd be the type to make a mountain out of a molehill, but when I found myself standing in the doorframe of my boyfriend's apartment, my breath caught in my throat at the sight of his bed, cluttered and filthy, as though a tornado had swooped through and decided to make it the epicenter of chaos. Clothes were strewn everywhere, mostly crumpled t-shirts and socks that I was sure had grown sentient from the level of stagnation and odors wafting through the air, and the sheets looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks. The stark contrast between the me who loved clean spaces and the him who seemed to revel in squalor became almost unbearable. I tried to mask my discomfort with a laugh, joking about how he was practically living in a pigsty, but deep down, the thought of laying in that unkempt space made my skin crawl. He just smiled back, oblivious, as he plopped onto the mattress, inviting me to join him. I hesitated, my mind racing with visions of all the microscopic horrors that could be lurking within that unclean sanctuary. "Are you serious?" I finally said, my voice rising slightly in disbelief. "I can't sleep in that thing." He frowned, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, anger, perhaps? Disappointment. I couldn't pin it down, but the mood shifted like the flicker of a candle just before it extinguishes. I backed away, shaking my head. "You need to clean up. I'm not going to sleep on whatever that is." He stood up, the disappointment morphing into something darker, like the thunderclouds gathering on the horizon. "Well, if you can't handle it," he spat, "maybe you don't deserve to be here at all." It felt like a slap to the face, and for a moment, hurt washed over me, replaced quickly by anger. "It's not about deserving, it's about hygiene. I thought you cared about your living space." But he glared at me as though I had just insulted a sacred relic, and I felt the tension coil into something like a visible entity between us. I was taken aback by the ferocity of his reaction, not having realized then just how deep the roots of his attachment to that mess went. He stormed past me, slamming a door I didn't even see behind him, and I took a shaky breath, stepping back out into the hall, needing to escape the oppressive atmosphere. I hesitated, wondering if I was being unreasonable, but I couldn't shake off a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I left his apartment and drove home, feeling the betrayal of the moment like a heavy fog suffocating my thoughts. Days passed without a word between us, and the silence was deafening. I kept replaying our argument in my head, trying to convince myself that I was justified in refusing to sleep in what felt like a den of filth, but my conscience was riddled with guilt. Just when I thought the tension would become unbearable, he reached out to me, sending a simple "I miss you." My heart flipped, and I immediately replied, arranging a dinner where we could sort everything out. But as I pulled into the parking lot, an unsettling chill crept down my spine, as though I were stepping into the lion's den armed only with my feeble attempts at diplomacy. I could see him waiting by the entrance, but this time, the usual warmth was replaced with a tension that twisted at my gut. "Let's talk in my apartment," he suggested, his voice eerily casual, too casual for how I felt. As we entered, I held my breath, bracing for the chaos of his lair, only to find it surprisingly clean. The bed was made, and the floor was swept. It felt almost alien in its transformation, but I was still cautious. "What happened?" I managed, crossing my arms defensively. "I cleaned up," he replied, wearing a smug grin. But the jovial tone in his voice fell flat as I noticed the strange glint in his eyes, something sinister lurking behind that practiced smile. I glanced around, uneasy, and sat on the edge of the couch rather than risking proximity to that once abominable bed. Over dinner, which he insisted on preparing himself, my unease only grew. The clattering of forks felt haunting, and as he spoke, I caught him watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I asked him about his sudden change in attitude, but the conversation felt forced, flitting over other topics and distractions. By the time we finished eating, I was ready to leave, but he broached a topic that sent chills straight to my core. "So, about my bed," he said, leaning closer, his eyes holding mine in an unwavering grip. "You know, I've always wanted to share that space with you. It means a lot to me." I felt a knot of dread seize my stomach. "You want me to sleep in that bed?" I shook my head, caution flaring in me. "You have to understand, I can't. I can't just forget what it was like. That's not just about cleanliness, it feels." I hesitated, looking for the right word. It felt unsafe. The smile vanished from his lips, replaced by something cold and deadly, and suddenly I could see that glint in his eyes morph into a shadow that seemed to envelop both of us. "Do you not trust me?" His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper, a threat sliding between the words, and I stumbled back, feeling a claustrophobic weight surround me. I started, trying to express the tangled mess of my thoughts, but the air became thick with an unsettling silence until he stood in front of me. "You never even tried to understand," he said quietly, his voice almost soothing as fear clawed at my insides. He took a step closer, and instinctively I stepped back. "Did you ever think that maybe the mess was a part of me?" I shook my head vigorously, trying to form a coherent response, but the walls felt like they were closing in, the space suddenly becoming intimate in the worst possible way. "I tried," I shouted, desperation clawing through my voice as he moved to block the exit, his expression shifting between puzzlement and anger. "I tried to understand, but there's a limit. I can't just ignore the feeling." "Feeling?" he echoed, voice dripping with mockery. "Why is it that you get to dictate what I am allowed to feel?" At this point, I knew I was in true danger. He was unraveling in front of me, the shape of the man I knew becoming something unfamiliar, grotesque. The fear urged me to scream, but I held it back, not wanting to escalate the situation. I pivoted, darting towards the kitchen and grabbing my phone, my only tether to the outside world. In one swift motion, I dialed for help, praying the police would pick up, but the second he realized what I was doing, I felt his hot breath against my neck. "You think you can get away that easily? You think calling someone is going to save you now?" I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, pounding like a war drum accompanied by visions of the boy I once loved morphing into something menacing. "You don't want to do this," I managed, my voice shaky. "I'm leaving." "You're not going anywhere," he hissed, and at that moment, the facade shattered completely, the man I had once cared for replaced by a creature I barely recognized. I dropped the phone, stumbling backward, heart racing as I searched for an escape route. "I thought we could share everything." His voice rang hollow, eyes dark, almost cavernous. I dashed towards the back door just as he lunged at me, his fingertips brushing the skin of my arm which felt like ice against my skin. I tore away from him, throwing open the door, sprinting into the night. My lungs burned as I ran, hearing him scream behind me, a sound so primal and furious that it sent adrenaline coursing through my veins, drowning out the audio of my panicked breaths. I didn't stop until I reached my car, nearly collapsing as I scrambled into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me like it could shield me from the chaos. My phone buzzed frantically in my pocket as I dialed the police for the second time, my voice trembling as I explained what had happened, the dispatcher's calm voice a lifeline in the storm. I kept glancing back at the apartment, haunted by the fear of him emerging once again, wishing I had never walked into that filthy sanctuary of his, wishing I had never dismissed my instincts. I was shaken to my core, and though I never thought I'd become someone who would rely on outward appearances to judge character, those first moments of discomfort rang alarmingly clear in my memory. A few officers arrived within minutes, breaking down the door only for it to reveal an untouched space. They found nothing, no sign of violence, no clues, but when they turned to me, concern etched on their faces, I realized that the thing that had terrified me most wasn't the dirt or the mess. It was what had been buried underneath, something festering and idle, a reflection of a darkness that came from the very mind of the man I once loved. And as the adrenaline faded and reality settled back in, I couldn't shake the chilling thought that I had narrowly escaped a fate that could have been so much worse, all because I had refused to share a dirty bed. Last month, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of chaos that turned my quiet suburban life upside down, all because of my near-adult son's gluten intolerance, which frankly seemed to surface just as he was nearing 18, insisting on gluten-free meals while treating me like the villain for refusing to cater to his whims. It all started innocently enough when I was rummaging through a dusty box of old family recipe cards, hoping to rediscover the love I once had for cooking, but the sound of my son's voice interrupted my daydreams of homemade pasta. The way he breathlessly announced his new dietary demands as if he had just won the lottery, and my heart sank, thinking of the ravaged gluten-filled meals we shared, the memories now tainted by his self-imposed culinary prison. I told him that cooking had always been a joy for me, but now it felt like I was being shackled with chains with every new gluten-free request, and yet there was something deeper I noticed in his eyes. A kind of desperation that struck me as odd, as if this was less about the food and more about something he wasn't telling me. But when I asked him why all of a sudden gluten was the enemy, he merely shrugged, muttering roughly about feeling better since spring started, and looking for a sense of control in a world that was rapidly falling apart around him. Still, no matter how many times I attempted to reason with him, he insisted on staying gluten-free, refusing any family meals I prepared unless they fit his strict parameters, which left me feeling like I was losing my grip on him. What's worse, he had a penchant for dragging me into his world of restrictive eating, and soon I was spending sleepless nights scrolling gluten-free recipes that felt more like torture than genuine interest. The thought of denying him any kind of dinner out together gnawed at my conscience, yet I was firm in my belief that he was simply going through a phase, the phase of teenage rebellion taken too far. And when he turned the heat up, I finally knew I had to put my foot down, refusing to take him out for meals, holding on to the hope that someday he'd break free of this ridiculous gluten-free fad and return to the son I once knew. My refusal only escalated tensions in our home, with every shared meal now threatening to collapse into an argument, and that's when things began to shift. I noticed something strange about the food I had started preparing. Dishes that had once been a source of comfort now felt tainted, an ominous shadow creeping into my kitchen. The taste of my chicken soup became metallic. Nothing matched up with memories of laughter and family gatherings around the table, as I shivered with the knowledge that something darker lurked within my own walls. Then, one evening while cleaning the basement, I stumbled upon an old recipe hidden beneath a pile of dust, scrawled in my late grandmother's handwriting, speaking of a healing herb, warning of its powers and how it could twist the body in response to the words sent out, and I couldn't help but feel a creeping dread that the reason for my son's sudden gluten intolerance wasn't a passing fad but something rooted in generations of our family, lingering remnants of old-world knowledge entwined with strange and twisted practices that we inherited without question, as if the very act of cooking was a ritual now twisted in ways we never understood. Inevitable outcomes loomed closer with each meal I prepared, twisting the knife further, the moment I faced him again over dinner after unearthing it, trying to mask my concern behind a veneer of normalcy. I watched as he devoured the food, his face twisting with each bite, making me question my own choices. The walls around us seemed to breathe as I asked if he liked the meal, praying for a different answer, when suddenly, everything fell silent. The fork slipped from his fingers, crashing against the plate as he doubled over. The horror on his face resonated with heartbreak. And I finally realized how the tables had turned. This wasn't just a diet where he could choose what to eat. It was metaphorically chaining his essence, his very being, transforming him into something I could barely recognize. Was it the food, the recipes, or something else entirely that sparked feelings of dread? Fat panic rising in my throat as he gasped, pleading with red-rimmed eyes for some semblance of gluten just to make it stop. Each breath he gasped fully paralyzing me into place as fear coursed through me and, in one moment of despair, I understood. I no longer had the power to create meals that nurtured and healed, but ones that hurt and betrayed. The panic only heightened when I realized time was running out, and my only option was to regain some semblance of control, but that control had slipped through my fingers, out of reach, like grains of gluten he no longer seemed able to stomach. I raced back to the basement, frantically flipping through those weathered recipe cards in search for the herb, hoping against hope that maybe I could salvage something from this mess before it consumed us both, when all the while, I couldn't shake the horrifying thought that I might just be the monster feeding the curse, forced to come to terms with a truth I wasn't prepared to face, that the answer to our demise might have been hidden down in dark corners far deeper than either of us could have ever imagined. Last summer, my friend Brian dared me to jump on his new trampoline after school, but I just shrugged it off, claiming I wasn't in the mood. Honestly, I felt a strange unease whenever I went near it, as if it were more of a portal than a simple backyard attraction. Brian was relentless, teasing me about being scared and insisting that it was perfectly safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You see, he had gotten that trampoline the previous weekend, almost impulsively, after attending a yard sale that offered it for a steal because the family was moving away quickly. As I tried to walk away from his persistent offers, I overheard Brian mention something about how the trampoline seemed alive to his little brother, Timmy, who was only 5 and had already developed this eerie attachment to it. I chuckled nervously, brushing off the remark, but later that night, I heard Timmy's laughter drifting into my window, and the sound was oddly distorted, a kind of echoing giggle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I told Brian about it the next day, he downplayed it, saying Timmy was just being a kid. Still, I couldn't help but remember the murmurings I had heard from the other kids at school, whispers about the last owners of that trampoline, the couple who vanished without a trace, leaving their house in disarray and their yard littered with the remnants of a normal family life. As days turned into weeks, and each day brought an increasing intensity of Timmy's obsession with the trampoline, I became more uneasy. I could often see him out there, springing into the air, laughing uncontrollably as if the trampoline was buoying him to new heights of joy. But every now and then, he would stop mid-jump, tilting his head as if listening to something from the shadows of their large oak tree. Finally, one late afternoon, I relented and agreed to join Brian and Timmy. As I climbed onto the trampoline, the surface felt unnaturally warm under my feet, almost pulsing, like it had a heartbeat. I tried to force a smile, bouncing gently, but that sensation of unease returned tenfold. It wasn't fear of falling, it was an instinctive dread that clawed at my stomach, warning me to get out before it was too late. Within minutes, Timmy returned to jumping, his laughter now edging towards something sinister. He would occasionally stop, staring wide-eyed at the ground, and that's when it hit me. I couldn't quite tell if he was laughing or if he was being called to something I couldn't see, a siren song that made him float just a little too close to the edge of sanity. That night, I lay in my bed, tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that the trampoline had changed something in Timmy. It wasn't just a plaything anymore. I can't explain it rationally, but I started having dreams, vivid and grotesque, dreams of wide-open spaces and crooked shadows, of children jumping in circles, their laughter resonating into an empty abyss. I woke in a cold sweat, and when I glanced out the window, there was Timmy again, bouncing on the trampoline beneath the pallid light of the moon, but this time, it was just him, alone, with that faint aura of something in the air, a palpable tension simmering beneath the surface. By the end of that week, Timmy's parents pulled him away from the trampoline, claiming it was time for bed. But I knew better. I could see how the glow of the moonlight dimmed to a dull hue, the energy changing palpably as their home became quieter. The very next morning, though, I was jolted awake by the sound of frantic knocks on my door. It was Brian, panting and wide-eyed. He said Timmy had vanished from his room, and the last time anyone saw him, he had been headed toward the trampoline. My heart raced as we sprinted down the street, the sun glaring down unforgivingly, making our urgency feel desperate. As we neared the house, I could sense an oppressive aura surrounding that backyard, as if the air itself was warning me. We found Timmy standing still on the trampoline, fully awake, staring deeply into the air above him. Brian called out to him, but there was no response. He didn't even blink. I felt paralyzed. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced with a heavy silence that froze the bone. I grabbed Brian and pulled him back as I gasped for breath. I suddenly realized that Timmy looked older, his little face somehow transformed by the week's events. Then, just like that, he jumped. And kept going. Higher and higher, defying all laws of gravity, until he reached an impossible altitude, hovering suspended in midair with a glint of wild joy in his eyes, a dark and glittering promise that horrified me. "Timmy, get down," Brian shouted in desperation as I felt my stomach drop. Something was terribly wrong. Timmy turned and held out a tiny hand, as if inviting us to join him in that eerie state of bliss, but it was too late. Before we could comprehend what was happening, he was swallowed by a cloud of shadows that erupted from the edges of the trampoline, swallowing the sunlight and everything with it, leaving us standing breathless on a hollow lot, gasping at the absence of laughter where there once was pure childhood joy. I was left haunted by the thought that I had refused to jump that day, that despite my instincts screaming at me to stay away from that thing, I did nothing to protect Timmy. I watched as Brian collapsed to his knees, screaming for his brother in desperation, while I stood rooted on the ground, knowing the truth that I could never share, that sometimes, the thrill of the jump is a gateway to something darker, something that doesn't want to be found. Weeks passed, but the trampoline remained there, a grim reminder of our stupidity, our refusal to listen to instinct rather than the shrieking laughter of a child that felt all too inviting. To this day, I wonder if giving in would have turned the tides, if perhaps Timmy and I could have escape those sinister depths together, but now, all I hear is the echo of his laughter from the lifeless backyard, making me question, was I truly the idiot for not jumping on that trampoline? I never thought a high school election could be the catalyst for so much chaos, but when I found myself losing the race for class president to Alex, a guy who was as popular as a sparkling social media influencer and twice as fake, something inside me snapped. Leading up to the election, I had poured my heart into my campaign, pouring countless hours into speeches and posters, all while trying to promote my vision of a more inclusive school, only to watch as Alex waltzed around, throwing lavish parties and posting perfectly staged selfies that made me feel like a ghost compared to his booming presence. On that fateful day, as the countdown to the announcement ticked down, I felt an undercurrent of dread snaking through my thoughts, an awareness that my passion for change stood no chance against shallow charm. When the principal finally declared Alex the winner, the sound of raucous applause and laughter felt like a dagger plunging into my chest, leaving me breathless with anger and humiliation. In a fit of rage, I stormed out of the auditorium, unable to contain my gnawing frustration, not just at losing but at the entire system that glorified mediocrity over genuine effort. I was tired of pretending it didn't matter. It did matter. Fueled by indignation, I hastily drafted a resignation letter on my phone, angrily posting it in our class group chat, bitterly declaring that there was no way someone like Alex could lead us. I thought my message might resonate, maybe even go viral around the school, but instead, it was met with a silence that felt heavier than the thundering applause I had just witnessed. The next day, however, my decision spiraled into something far more sinister. My phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, but not of support. Instead, my peers turned on me, the whispers and snickers echoing down hallways like a haunting wind, leaving me isolated. I had unleashed something I couldn't contain, a dark curiosity started spreading. Who were these people I once called friends, who pretended loyalty while eagerly stoking the coals of someone else's success? I began to notice strange things around me, my locker mysteriously jammed with an array of sticky notes, taunting me with phrases like just a loser or a standing ovation for Alex. Every morning before first period, there was something new, something that felt eerily tailored just for me, an intelligent push of humiliation that seemed to stalk my every step. That's when I saw the first video, a poorly lit, grainy clip of a group of students huddled together near the library, whispering and pointing at me, hatching conspiracies about my sour grapes and my unpopularity. It made my skin crawl, the realization that I was being hunted, and not for sport, but for fun, twisted their laughter into something monstrous. I tried talking to a teacher, but the weight of my accusations fell flat. They simply encouraged me to turn the other cheek and think positively. But how could I? Those whispers chose me as their entertainment. I knew I couldn't let this go. I began obsessively scrolling through social media, seeking recognition of my turmoil, wondering if others felt it too. I stumbled upon an obscure forum, a shadowy place where school dramas festered and spilled into the digital abyss, a chaotic collection of stories that made mine seem mundane. But buried in that cacophony was a community that thrived on misfortune, a hive intent on exposing what they deemed hidden truths. It was the perfect storm, and I couldn't look away. As weeks turned into months, I became a reluctant participant in this new narrative unfolding, a corner of cyberspace that amplified the vindictive laughter I felt daily. I learned that Alex wasn't just skating by on privilege, he had secrets of his own, and in that forum, I was pushed by an anonymous figure toward the darkest corners of gossip. I started posting about my experiences, disguised through an anonymous handle, weaving a narrative that cast me as the unyielding hero fighting against the corruption. I expected support, but received something unexpected, a raw, visceral acknowledgement of pain. Those who saw my plight echoed it back to me, but the moment I dared to mention Alex's shadowy connections, the laughter morphed into something darker, urging me to dig deeper. Days turned into a fever dream, losing track of what was real and what was a manufactured facade. So, when I finally decided to take action, concocting elaborate schemes to expose Alex, plotting to record him making lewd remarks hidden behind the bathrooms, my sense of moral clarity was long gone. I knew I had crossed a line, but it was intoxicating, like a drug feeding a mania that pulsated through every fiber of my being. Now, even in the dead of night, I would scroll through my phone, glued to what was once my biggest fear, the threat of being unknown, the scorn of being invisible, all black and white images blurring into the chaotic storm that consumed me. Then came the night that everything crashed. In the depths of a swirling digital web, Alex's world collided with mine, and secrets fell like raindrops during a storm. During a party, I confronted him, armed with evidence of his misdeeds, but ended up cornered, outnumbered by his smug entourage. I was desperate, crying out about everything that had been done to me, about the lies and the clenched fists of the school's social hierarchy, but no one cared. They laughed at my anguish, drowning me in a cascade of ridiculing comments and shoves. The weight of humiliation twisted inside me, morphing into something more sinister, until I felt myself reach a breaking point. I don't know what happened next. Maybe adrenaline took over, or something darker that had been festering inside erupted like a volcano, but in that moment, I snapped. I lunged at Alex, screaming. The throng around us scattered, shocked, but it didn't matter. I felt unstoppable as I threw him against a wall, the sound of his head connecting with the metal locker echoing through the hallway, a warning clap to the mocking audience. As the chaos unfolded around me, blurred by my own rage, I thought about how everything had gotten so out of hand, how a simple school election had turned me from hopeful visionary to deranged antagonist in my own story. From that moment on, I realized I couldn't hide any more from the truth that had chased me simply because I had chosen to be vulnerable. There, in that moment of exposed honesty, I didn't care if it cost me everything. I was done being the side character in someone else's narrative. I remember the day my friend Jay gave me the expensive clothes like it was etched into my mind, a vibrant blur of silk and stitch set against the mundane backdrop of my cluttered apartment. Jay was a fashion influencer, strutting through life like a peacock, draped in designer pieces that sparkled in the sunlight. We met in college, two misfits who bonded over weird hobbies and alternative music, and just when I thought I was past the days of scraping by, Jay surprised me with bags overflowing with items from his latest collaboration, luxury clothes that danced around their own presence with excellence. My heart swelled at the gift. I didn't just see clothes, but a ticket to a world I felt I could never belong to, a place where confidence dripped from every seam. For weeks, I wore those clothes like armor, striding through life with newfound bravado. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers complimented me, their kind words wrapping around me like a warm embrace as I reveled in the prestige those clothes brought. But as my inner circle of friends began to dwindle, whispers ran through our group. Some suggested I sell them for a quick buck, pieces like that fetched sky-high prices, they said, while others told me horror stories about friends who had borrowed expensive items and ruined them. One night, over too many cheap beers and too much bravado, I decided to post the clothes online, just to see what interest might spark, but when I woke up that morning, I felt sick at the thought. Jay had spat out warnings about the pitfalls of selling gifts, their possessions no longer, and the moment you let them go, something within you starts to wither just like that little green plant in my apartment that never thrived. The next day, Jay texted me, asking if I'd reconsider. His tone was neither accusing nor pleading, simply curious, had I really done it? I agonized, my stomach twisting like a kite caught in the wind, and the guilt clawed at me like a feral cat. I texted back, I didn't sell it, I just thought about it. His response was cool, but something flickered in the back of my mind. Was he disappointed? That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end sent a chill down my spine, a low, gravelly tone that pierced through the average daytime noise. "It's important you meet me," it rasped, and something deep in my gut screamed danger. I hung up, my heart racing like a train on a crooked track, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It gnawed at me for days. Then came the confrontation over dinner, the smells of pizza and soda fading into a background haze as Jay's voice cut through the silence. "You need to sell them, you're missing the opportunity here," he urged, but there was something darker behind his eyes, the flicker of something almost predatory, and as I lifted my glass, I realized that his grip on the table trembled slightly. "You don't get it. I can't take something precious and just throw it away," I reasoned, but he leaned closer, and I was struck by an icy claw of fear. "They don't belong to you," he hissed, his fingers curling like talons around the remnants of his slice of pizza, and I felt that inexplicable emptiness inside me flare into something jagged and immense. Later that night as I tossed and turned, my phone buzzed like a vibrant insect in the darkness. It was Jay, asking me for a photo of the clothes, seemingly innocent, but I could feel that disturbing edge underneath, coiling tighter around my mind. Caught between paranoia and friendship, I decided to ignore it, but my reluctance spiraled into an insatiable paranoia as every knock on my door echoed through my dreams. Weeks crawled by, and out of nowhere, I began receiving mysterious messages, strangers reaching out claiming to know Jay, their words slick with venom that suggested I needed to wear those clothes again or risk facing a spiritual wrath. The clothes, I learned, bore an offense only those deep in the fashion underworld could understand. They weren't mere garments, they were trophies of popularity, each thread woven from the hopes and struggles of those who desired fame before me. What had I stumbled into? I wondered, but every time I tried to confront Jay, he sidestepped me, elusive and disquietingly charming. One evening, in an effort to reclaim control, I turned on the lights in my living room and held the clothes hostage in plain sight, confronting them like they were sentient beings with an unholy agenda. I snapped a picture, half expecting to see demons lurking around the edges of the frame. Days passed in a muffled haze, but then came the night. It was stormy, the wind howling like a pack of lost souls. I sat on my couch with a glass of wine, considering burning them rather than selling them, my heart drumming with the rhythm of fear and guilt. That's when the phone rang. Eyes wide, I answered, and it was Jay again, frantic and clawing. "You want your life back. You have to wear them. If you don't, you'll never be free," he screamed through the receiver, almost incoherent. I felt tears prick at my eyes as I hung up. A tempest of panic swelled, but an insidious part of me wondered if wearing the clothes would liberate me from the shackles that had been tightening around my heart. Just that night, amid crashing thunder, I slipped into the most regal piece Jay had gifted me. Instantly, a wave of euphoria washed over, making me feel alive and powerful. The clothes wrapped around me like an embrace that transcended simple aesthetics. But as dawn approached and the light turned madly crimson, a creeping sensation clawed its way up my spine, and I caught a glimpse of myself in the old mirror. The reflection that looked back at me was distorted, twisted. It was Jay's face morphing into mine, wearing my own features in a grotesque parody. I felt the full weight of the clothes dragging me deeper into a void, and suddenly the price of acceptance became evident. The expensive threads were binding me to him. I stumbled back, ripping the clothes off as the fabric felt like razor blades against my skin, and while they landed in a heap on the floor, the moment they fell, the twisted vision vanished. Jay called for me again, begging, pleading, almost crying, and I went cold inside. I locked my door and tossed the clothes into the old furnace in my building's basement, adrenaline buzzing like a hive. Before I could feel relief, the pounding on my apartment door echoed through my mind. Jay, desperately wanting to reclaim what was his, but they weren't his anymore. "You can't throw them away. They're mine to control," he shouted, his voice breaking and unraveling into something almost pitiful. I didn't respond, just sat against the door, feeling the weight of both decisions crashing onto my shoulders. Hours crept by, and as the sun rose, I felt the tension lift as if a dark cloud had finally broken. But as I settled into that dawning tranquility, my phone buzzed with notifications, cold dread seeping back into my bones. Picture after picture poured in, Jay wearing them one by one, each snap more distorted and vengeful than the last. The final image etched a nightmare into my mind, Jay's face, grinning sickeningly as he held up a crude feedback board of my friends begging me to join them in this fashion parade, my reflection emerging from the depths of hell itself, a twisted war of dominance vibrant enough to burn the retina. At that moment, lying on my kitchen floor, I felt like I was ripped apart by threads of consequence and heartbreak. Jay wasn't just a friend anymore, he was a creature of desire, hungry for the essence that tethered me to the world I thought I understood. I was escalating into his warped image of fame, and all I could do was huddle in the corner of the room, wondering whether the price was too steep. It dawned on me then that the clothes hadn't just been a gift, they were a curse, a striking reminder that sometimes, when greed wraps its hands around your heart, it obliterates not just what you have but the familiar warmth of the person you thought you once knew. I never thought attending my aunt's baby shower would lead to the kind of nightmare I could barely comprehend, but looking back, the entire day felt like a slow-motion train wreck that I could do nothing to stop. The moment I stepped into her lavishly decorated living room, filled with pastel-colored balloons and annoyingly cute decorations, a sense of dread washed over me. My aunt, who had always been the fun relative, was now the center of attention for her impending motherhood, and I was just a reluctant guest somewhat dragged into it by family obligations. As we congregated in a circle, playing those absurd games no one genuinely enjoyed, I felt the weight of the pressure to put on a smile, pretend I cared, and above all, be respectful, even though I knew I had no intention of doing so. You see, I had secretly vowed not to attend if the invitation didn't specifically ask for me. In essence, it was a pity invite, and I wasn't about to humor her for the sake of appearances. She could hardly keep her enthusiasm in check as she opened gifts, which only added fuel to my frustration. As she unwrapped yet another onesie garnished with cartoon elephants, the urge to unleash my disdain boiled inside me, colliding with the social facade I was trying to uphold. That's when my cousin's judgmental gaze caught mine. It was one of those looks that said, "Are you really going to spoil this?" And in that moment, I snapped. Without thinking, I blurted, "You should have picked a different theme, Aunt Linda, this one just screams desperately trying to cope with reality." The room fell silent. I could almost hear the collective intake of breath, the awkward shifting of chairs. Aunt Linda's smile faltered, her hands froze midair, cradling a pastel gift bag. What I now realized was a colossal faux pas on my part that I could never take back. I thought I might hear laughter, perhaps even a sarcastic comment to lighten the mood, but it was only my heart pounding in my ears as embarrassment washed over her and me in equal measure. She tried to laugh it off, a strained sound that only added to the tension, but the damage was done. Cousins exchanged glances, probably wondering what kind of monster they had in their family. As the clock ticked by, so did my humiliation, morphing into something darker. I could sense my aunt's dwindling excitement, like a balloon slowly deflating, and suddenly the quaint surroundings felt sinister, as if the pastel decorations were laughing at me. The whispers began, not just about my comment but about my intentions. I was somehow branded the villain of the day, the one who could not tolerate the simple joy of family. And then, the lights flickered, subtle at first, like a knowing wink, but with each passing moment, they gradually dimmed further until it felt like the room had shifted entirely. I could hear the sound of muffled conversations echoing around the walls, each echoed word dripping with disdain towards me even as more presents were opened, but what really unnerved me was the realization that with each present emptied of its novelty, my aunt seemed to grow smaller, lost beneath the heaps of expectation. As cupcakes were served, I could taste the bitterness of my own words lingering on my tongue, and the silence thickened as if we were all trapped in a bubble too surreal to puncture. Unable to bear the atmosphere any longer, I left the room, mumbling something about needing water, but what I found was unexpectedly horrifying. The hallway was dark, and my own shadow felt cloaked in a fog, twisting in ways that threatened to swallow me whole. Glancing back, I caught sight of Aunt Linda, who stood silhouetted in the doorway, a chilling stillness radiating from her. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift behind her, something not quite right, a swirling darkness that lurked at the edges of the light, whispering secrets I dared not grasp. I wanted to retreat, but my legs wouldn't move as curiosity and fear wrestled within me. Just as I mustered the courage to step closer, the air thickened around me, and I heard a faint melody, almost like a lullaby, that filled the space with weight and melancholy. The kind of song that might soothe an infant while sending shivers up the spines of grown adults. And then in that eerie calm, Aunt Linda turned, and I swear I saw something flicker across her face, a shadow of anger or perhaps disappointment so profound that I understood. In that moment, it was something far deeper than the trivial squabble we just had. I would later wish I had turned back when the last guest left, because the darkness that followed me into the living room wasn't just an absence of light, it enveloped me in a fear I couldn't fully articulate. I could barely follow the stifled conversation as my relatives buzzed about gifts and game scores. A soft sob reached my ears from where Aunt Linda stood, and in that instant of realization, I understood that the baby shower was not merely a celebration, but a last-ditch effort for her sanity amidst the growing anticipation, the kind that had swallowed her long before I opened my mouth. When I finally returned home, exhausted and filled with regret, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in Aunt Linda's house had wrapped around her like a stalker, that they were now straining to break free, dragging her down into a world that would never be the same again. And soon, I had to face the truth. Sometimes, an unfiltered moment of honesty could unravel something fragile, something unwanted, leaving me wondering just how far I had crossed the line of being the family embarrassment, and if I might have awakened something darker within her that no one else would have to confront but me. Days passed into weeks, and every time my phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Linda, I hesitated, knowing that the silence between us had morphed into a chasm too wide to bridge. I'd come to realize that perhaps my failure to exhibit tact was not purely about a single moment, but about something profound. Her descent after the shower had spiraled into a silence filled with shadows that felt tragically suffocating. And while I should have reached out with an apology, I remained sequestered in my own turmoil, fearing that each unreturned message was a dagger aimed at the heart of my conscience, pushing me deeper into the abyss of guilt. Little did I know that guilt would soon transform into dread as vague whispers tainted the air around me, and the creeping sense that I had not just embarrassed my aunt but set something free snaked through the cracks of my reality like a shattering dreamscape. And in that unsettling blend of right and wrong, I found myself asking the haunting question that wouldn't let me go. Was I really the villain in this story, or had I merely opened a door that should have remained shut? I'm writing this because I'm overwhelmed and terrified, and honestly, I don't know who to turn to because the whole thing feels surreal, like something out of a nightmare, and if I don't get it out there, I feel like I might explode. It started when I got engaged to my longtime boyfriend, Mike, and decided to have a small wedding in the woods near our favorite hike, nature-themed, simple, and intimate with just a handful of close friends and family for a lovely, rustic gathering. We were excited about everything, but when it came to the cake, we decided to go vegan since my best friend, Kylie, is vegan and had been there for me through thick and thin. We wanted everyone to enjoy it equally, without feeling pressured, and there's this small bakery that makes the most decadent vegan cakes, chocolate with raspberry filling, my absolute favorite. They assured me that the texture was just as rich as a traditional cake, and honestly, I was all in, so I ordered it and kept the choice a secret, wanting to surprise everyone. The day of the wedding arrived, and the air was crisp, filled with the sweet aroma of pine and flowers. The sound of laughter and soft music floated in the breeze as we exchanged our vows, surrounded by the natural beauty that had brought us together. The cake was everything I hoped it would be, a centerpiece topped with wildflowers, and everyone marveled at it when it was revealed, but as soon as someone took a bite, an odd heaviness fell over the gathering. The look on Uncle Barry's face was a mix of confusion and horror as he wiped remnants of cake from his mouth. A ripple of murmurs spread through the group, and before I knew it, Kylie was storming up to me with a scowl that could peel paint. Apparently, during her speech about happiness and acceptance, she inadvertently revealed the cake's vegan nature, which catapulted the guests into what felt like a modern-day witch trial. Barry, arms flailing, demanding to know why I had tricked him into eating something I hadn't labeled properly. It all spiraled out of control. Suddenly, guests were accusing me, some saying they felt disrespected by the deception, while others stood up for me, defending the choice and emphasizing taste over labels. I felt trapped in the eye of a storm, where accusations and judgments collided like thunder. I tried to explain my intentions, how I wanted to bring everyone together, but the more I spoke, the angrier they became, some claiming that it's unethical not to make dietary choices clear, which I didn't think was fair when at every event, there's bound to be someone who doesn't agree with the choices made. The tension was suffocating, and soon, guests began to leave one by one. I could see the disappointment written on my mother's face. She'd put everything into making this day special, but all I felt was shame invading my mind. I desperately sought out Mike, who was trying to calm Barry down in a corner, their voices rising with each heated word. Finally, unable to hold back anymore, I turned to Barry and said I was sorry but that he was being dramatic. That apparently triggered the lid off a boiling pot. Somehow, the conversation shifted, and not only was I under fire for the cake, but the whole wedding became a mess that solely fell on my shoulders, with even my mom chiming in with her disappointment. People began packing up the gifts, and I couldn't even process what was happening. Instead, I felt trapped in an absolute nightmare, and I began to weep while holding the remains of the cake, its beauty now marred by a strange mix of frosting and guilt. I lost track of time as people slipped away into the waning light, their murmured judgments still echoing in my head, and I could scarcely absorb the fact that my wedding day had transformed into a circus of accusations over a slice of cake. I caught snippets of conversations as the last of the guests trickled out, and someone even suggested that I should have known better than to force a cake with false marketing on them. I truly hadn't meant to upset anyone. How could a cake embody so much hostility? That night, Mike and I headed back home, his mood reflecting the dimness in my heart. He offered me a half-hearted consolation, mentioning how everyone was being overly dramatic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow ruined our biggest day over something that should have brought joy. Scrolling mindlessly through my phone later, I stumbled upon posts on social media clarifying their positions on veganism as if it were a debate about morality. It tore at my heart when I discovered pictures of my wedding cake, captioned with anger, disillusion, and disbelief from guests recounting the horror of being tricked. That night, I had dreams of each guest's scornful face as they took their first bite, transformed into grotesque figures, shouting that I had robbed them of their right to true desserts. I woke up drenched in sweat, barely able to stomach breakfast, each glance in the mirror reminding me of the shame that lingered so heavy on my conscience. It's been weeks since the wedding, and things slowly returned to normal, but I haven't spoken to Kylie since. She messaged me once to say she felt embarrassed, but I didn't respond, the disappointment in her voice too much for my heart to bear. From my peripheral, I've sensed Barry lurking online, recounting the wedding misstep in forums, initiating dialogues about what it means to purposefully hide vegan options, while I sit here haunted by memories of a beautiful day turned sour over a cake. I wondered if it was worth it to stand up for my decision or if they were right, and the guilt eats me alive. So, am I the asshole for refusing to label my wedding cake as vegan? I just wanted to create a joyful memory, and instead, it feels like I've broken an invisible contract of trust over something intended to be delicious and inclusive, and I can't shake the horrible feeling that whatever small sliver of pride I had in my choice has suddenly turned into something heavy, dark, and deeply harmful. I never thought I would reach the point where I had to cut my sister out of our weekly family dinners, but the moment she showed up with her son, Ethan, wearing a shirt that read "I don't care" and a scowl that could melt ice, I knew this was going to be different. Each week it had turned into a circus act, with Ethan running wild, climbing on furniture, and hollering about how everyone else was boring, while my sister, Lisa, just sat there scrolling through her phone, occasionally muttering half-hearted attempts to curb his antics. My parents would smile awkwardly, trying to ignore the chaos while I gritted my teeth, feeling every tentative attempt to make a meal or share a moment together slipping away like grains of sand. On one particularly disastrous evening, Ethan managed to grab a handful of mashed potatoes and fling them across the table, where they landed squarely in my dad's lap. Instead of mortification or an apology, Lisa just laughed it off, throwing her head back like this mess was some kind of comedy show. I snapped. "He needs boundaries, Lisa. You can't just let him act however he likes." Her laughter immediately turned into a glare as she shot back, "Really? Is that how you treat your kids? With such high expectations?" The accusation struck deep. I could feel my heart rate quicken, each beat echoing my growing frustration. So, after that night, or should I say debacle, I made a decision. I would stop inviting her until she could either parent her son or keep her opinions about how I raise my kids to herself. At first, it felt empowering, a way to reclaim my sanity, but then she began to retaliate, posting veiled messages on social media about the burden of judgment and family forgiveness. I felt a twinge of guilt each time I saw those whispers online, but my resolve was firm, like a wall against the tidal wave of her emotional blackmail. Weeks turned into months, and I convinced myself that I was the adult in the room, enforcing a boundary that had desperately needed reinforcing. But the longer I kept her at bay, the more I could feel something dark unraveling, like an uninvited guest finally revealing their true nature. I would wake up panicking some nights after dreaming of Ethan, screaming in a distorted version of my face, his laughter turning hollow as if he was mocking me for trying to carve out my sanctity. Then, one day, a message popped up on my phone. It was Lisa, a simple plea, "Can we talk? I miss you." I was caught off guard, my heart cautiously optimistic. Maybe she understood. Maybe this time would be different. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop, the space buzzing with life, but the air between us felt suffocatingly thick. As she fidgeted with her cup, I braced myself, ready to hear her new understanding of parenthood or, at the very least, some acknowledgement of our strained relationship. Instead, she exploded, "You think you're better than me because you get to dictate who I can bring around? Ethan is my son, and he'll be how he wants to be, just like I will." I was taken aback by her intensity, like staring into a storm brewing on the horizon. My mind raced, thoughts tangled up as I fought the urge to defend myself. "I'm not better, Lisa. I'm just trying to make sure our family dinners don't feel like a war zone. I need you to step up." Instead of a resolution, we only escalated, voices raised until people were glancing over, expressions of concern flickering across their faces. In that moment, it was like the earth beneath me split open, revealing something dark and twisted, years of resentment, envy, and a complete misunderstanding of what family meant. The coffee shop felt stifling, too warm, too bright, and when she abruptly stood, throwing her half-empty cup on the table and storming out, I felt like I had broken something precious and irreversible. Days turned into weeks, and the silence hung heavily in the air, permeating my every thought until even my kids began to notice my despondence. One night, while tucking my son into bed, I overheard them whispering about how Aunt Lisa didn't love us anymore. Their innocent whispers pricked me, forcing me to face the nature of my estrangement. It was a pattern, a wound we were both festering that seemed impossible to stitch back together. The turning point came in the form of a phone call. It was my mother on the other end, sounding distraught. "It's Lisa. She's not doing well," she breathed heavily. I felt my stomach churn, a deep pit forming as I heard the cracks of her voice. It turned out Ethan had been caught stealing from a store, and in a fit of despair, he had lashed out at his mom, claiming that she never cared. The lines continued to blur, the good, the bad, my choices, her choices, and the children caught in the crossfire. Later that same day, I stood outside their apartment, the familiar knocking on the door filled with a weight I wasn't sure I could lift. When Lisa finally opened up, her eyes were red, and her cheeks streaked with tears. I expected anger or confusion, perhaps even a breath of pride in her parenting. Instead, she crumpled at the sight of me, relentless anguish welling up in her gaze as she fell into my arms. I'm failing, and I don't know how to fix this. Those words hung heavy in the air, laced in heartbreak and desperation. In that moment, I realized that we weren't just fighting over dinner invitations, we were wrestling with our fears and insecurities as parents. And as I held her, my heart began to soften. We began a long conversation that felt like a true reckoning. Those dinners we had both associated with chaos transformed into a healing ground, a space for vulnerability and support rather than the judgment we had projected onto one another. It took time, but soon enough, laughter replaced the tension, and while Ethan's antics didn't disappear entirely, resilience threaded its way back into our family fabric. I learned that sometimes, letting go of boundaries doesn't mean accepting chaos but inviting each other to grow and learn within that chaos, and maybe, just maybe, love would find its way back to our table one meal at a time.